Hi, this is Yulia, and you're watching my channel, Rebels and Revolutions. We are on our third episode of the Fascist Revolution in Italy. Last time, we left good old Benito in crisis. All of his socialist doctrines have been challenged by the realpolitik of pre-war Europe. He was now vocally supporting the war, describing it as a just war against the outdated tyrannical monarchies of Europe. For these heresies, he was promptly fired from his position as editor of the socialist newspaper Avanti and kicked out from the Socialist Party. Shockingly, it did not take Mussolini long to open another newspaper that he called Il Popolo d'Italia, where he began to promote his new set of ideas. Meanwhile, Republicans in Italy became the driving force behind the movement to compel the Italian government to join the war alongside France, England, and Russia. Interventionists and Republicans formed an organization that they called Fasci Nazione Rivoluzionaria Intervenista, after the fasci, the bundle of sticks carried by the lictors in ancient Rome. One stick can be broken, but bundled together, they were indestructible. As the war began, Mussolini wasted no time joining the Italian army and fighting bravely. After being seriously wounded, he was sent back home as a war hero who spilled his blood to defend his motherland. His credibility had never been higher. Mussolini understood very clearly that the idea of international solidarity of the proletariat was now dead, as Italian workers dressed in military uniforms were shooting at Austrian workers who were fighting in the Austrian army. And the group that Italian soldiers hated even more than their enemies were those socialist traitors who, at home, were advocating for a policy of neutrality, and even worse, cooperation with the enemy. And Mussolini was exploiting this sentiment with gusto. Let's pause here, in order to highlight an interesting dynamic. While the Russian soldiers were sitting in cold, damp trenches fighting Germans and Austrians, they became increasingly disillusioned with the war and drifted aggressively to the left into the arms of the Bolsheviks. At the same time, Italian soldiers were also stuck in cold and damp trenches on the Alfonso River, fighting Austrians and Germans, while drifting increasingly to the right on the political spectrum, eventually forming the core of Mussolini's power base. The cause of this apparent contradiction was money. The German and Austrian governments were pouring boatloads of funds into the blossoming revolutionary movements in Russia, with a clear understanding that if Lenin were to succeed, he will effectively take Russia out of the war. Germans paid for a special train that took the Bolshevik elite to Russia through the German territory in the fall of 1917 and financed its agitation campaign. Now, the Bolsheviks were the only political force in Russia who promised to send the soldiers back home. This promise greatly contributed to the popularity of the Soviet committees in the Russian armed forces. In contrast, Britain and France were keenly interested in getting Italy to fight on their side, while keeping Italian troops fighting until the bitter end. Thus, Britain and France also poured boatloads of money into anyone who had political influence to help rouse Italians to greatness. It is hardly a secret that Mussolini and his Il Popolo d'Italia was a darling of the British Foreign Office and a clear beneficiary of its financial generosity. This is precisely how Mussolini was able to open his own newspaper immediately after being fired from the socialist one. The end of the First World War was bittersweet for Italy. While the Allies did win the war, Italy was relegated to the role of a junior partner at the post-war negotiation table at Versailles. When it came time to divide the spoils, Italy got Trieste, which is exactly what Austria offered them at the start of the war in exchange for remaining neutral. And Italy could have saved 500,000 lives. Clearly, many Italians were deeply dissatisfied that they did not get Dalmatia, Dodecanese Islands, and several other territories they were hoping to obtain. And as the war machine was no longer needed, the economy was bound to hit another rough patch. Italian workers, most likely left-leaning fellows since they stayed away from the fighting during the war, were already nervous about their jobs. In addition, 1 million or so returning soldiers were gunning for their jobs, and the soldiers were not welcomed as heroes, but rather as a threat. And since the returning Italian troops had zero tolerance for those socialist traitors who were accusing them of not achieving much during the war, social tensions escalated right away. Soldiers felt that the government also sold them down the river, and even the traditional pillar of Italian morality, religion, let them down, with the Vatican repeatedly calling to stop the war. With a victory in sight, such calls were viewed in the trenches with great disappointment. Italian soldiers needed a new idea to believe in. Sensing all of these notions, Mussolini floated the idea of unification of most of the right-leaning groups into a single party, Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. And on the 23rd of March, 1919, its first Congress took place in Milan. What happened next is well known and understood. Fascist squadristi, or black shirts, and socialists were at each other's throats in every Italian city, burning down each other's newspaper buildings and party headquarters. Gradually, it became clear that due to their superb discipline and almost uniform military experience, remember, most local chapters of the fascist organization were constantly refreshed with new soldiers coming back home, fascistes gained the upper hand. Soon, they became bold enough to take over entire cities for a day or two with full cooperation of local police forces and military units, which also consisted mainly of former soldiers and thus were sympathetic to the black shirts. The famous March on Rome was the culmination of this rise of parliamentary and political power in Italy, becoming the pinnacle of this unique revolution, which was accomplished by artfully combining perfectly legal methods with utterly unconstitutional tactics. And this will be the focus of our last episode in this series. See you next time on my channel, Rebels and Revolutions. So long!